Hi, everyone. My name is Jocelyn Getchin-Kestenbaum, and I'm Associate Professor of Clinical Law at the Benjamin N. Cardozo School of Law and Director of the Cardozo Law Institute in Holocaust and Human Rights. Before we begin the topic of today's discussion, I would like to take this time to acknowledge that the Benjamin N. Cardozo School of Law is situated on the Lenape island of Manahata'n in Lenape-Hoking, the Lenape homeland. We pay respect to Lenape peoples, past, present, and future, and their continuing presence in the homeland and throughout the Lenape diaspora. I welcome you to today's discussion entitled Linking Concepts of Public Health, Mental Health, and Mass Atrocity Prevention. This is the first online discussion of several that we're hosting as part of our digital dialogue series, and it's showcasing our new co-edited volume, Public Health, Mental Health, and Mass Atrocity Prevention. If you're interested in purchasing the book, the link for that purchase is dropped into the chat where you can order it, and there's a discount code as well for participants that you can take advantage of. Our next series discussion will take place online Wednesday, November 10th, and the invitation will be sent out soon, so look out for that and future updates on this incredible series of authors, both at the scholarly and practitioner levels, at these intersections of the important fields that we all work in for identity-based violence prevention. The Cardozo Law Institute in Holocaust and Human Rights, also known as CLEAR, is a leading global center for the study, teaching, and promotion of human rights. We strengthen laws, norms, and institutions to prevent mass atrocities, protect affected populations, and rebuild societies in the aftermath of atrocity crimes. As a think tank, CLEAR furthers the theory and scholarship of human rights and atrocity prevention, while our action arm, the Benjamin B. Ferencz Human Rights and Atrocity Prevention Clinic, trains law students in human rights and atrocity prevention practice. Before we begin, I want to go over a few housekeeping items. First, this panel is being recorded, and the recording will be distributed on our Twitter account, and you can follow us at Cardozo Clear. Second, I'll begin with a conversation with our distinguished panelists, and then we'll open up the floor for an audience Q&A. So if you have any questions, please drop them into the Q&A box, and we'll do our best to address them toward the end of our event. We will also be stating a special CLE code throughout the discussion. So if anyone is requesting CLE, you'll need to note this code for the 1.5 CLE credits that we're offering today. Finally, I want to give a special thanks to our panelists for joining us today, to CLEAR's program coordinator, Ali Kane, and our student fellow, Lizzie Sokloff, for organizing this event, and to the Cardozo Events Office for their unwavering support of everything that we are doing at CLEAR. A little about this book and project. This is a multidisciplinary volume that considers the role of public health and mental health policies and practices in the prevention of mass atrocity. And that includes war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocide, and the crime of aggression. It brings together diverse fields of study by both Global North and Global South authors, and those are both scholars and practitioners in the field, in diverse contexts. And it culminates in a narrative that demonstrates the state of the current fields on intersecting themes within the public health, mental health, and mass atrocity prevention spaces. And it also discusses the potential directions in which these intersections could go. The idea is that public health tools and frames can inform and improve atrocity prevention practice. Both fields are interested in preventing harms on a societal or population level. Both fields are also interested in structural and social risks that are risk factors for harm. Public health is about changing structures to reduce disease risks, while atrocity prevention looks at reducing these structural and social risk factors for preventing mass violence. Both frames care about positive deviance or resilience factors as well, what makes individuals, communities, and entire populations not fall to mass atrocity, violence, or health harms? How can we learn from those resilient individuals, groups, and communities? The various scholars and practitioners of this volume find that atrocity prevention has a lot to learn from public health tools and practice, and atrocity prevention fields can also inform and improve public health and mental health practice for prevention and for healing. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce today's panelists who will kick off our digital dialogue series. They each have very impressive and extensive backgrounds, which will be shared in the chat box. Randall DeFalco is Assistant Professor of Law at the University of Hawaii at Manoa William S. Richardson School of Law, and his research focuses on how international criminal law addresses harms brought about by causal processes. Laura Miller-Graf is Associate Professor of Psychology and Peace Studies at the University of Notre Dame, and her research examines developmental effects of exposure to violence in childhood. And last, but certainly not least, Ellie Smith is a legal practitioner and academic who is an expert on survivor needs and trauma within the justice system. So I'm going to start off our conversation, and I want to start with you, Randall. First, could you briefly describe your work at the intersections of these fields and give us a sense of the ways that you approach the issue of mass atrocity crimes prevention? In addition, tell us a little bit more about the larger objective that you have in this book chapter and in your larger scholarly work in framing, or maybe I should say reframing, atrocity violence through a public health lens. What is served socially and legally in reframing these harms?
So first, I just want to say thanks, Jocelyn, for that question and for inviting me. I want to thank you and everyone at CLEAR for putting together the volume and inviting me here today, especially Ali, who's been tireless and I know working behind the scenes. So first, that thanks. But so in terms of my own work, I spend a lot of time thinking about what goes into the process of dividing up what mass harms, kind of dividing those perceived broadly, both socially and legally, as potential international, atrocity crimes, versus those being viewed as inherently non-criminal in nature. So I came to this topic first while looking into the potential criminal accountability in Cambodia for famine and associated living conditions enforced on the civilian population by the Khmer Rouge regime. And in an overarching and somewhat oversimplified sense, there is this divide that I found to exist. So mass harms tend to be placed conceptually into one of two baskets, right? Potentially criminally forms of direct or physical violence and inherently non-criminal forms of structural violence. So in many cases, this rough binary classification may hold true. And due to criminal law's exclusive focus on individualized assessments of conduct and culpability, this is sometimes true, but I've come to view this as an inaccurately kind of blunt way of categorizing the often complex causal processes involved in producing mass harms. So in my view, this binary is false, and in reality, what exists is more of a spectrum. Harms are more or less directly caused, more or less structural in nature. And so, for example, returning to the example of famine in Cambodia, one could argue that the causal dynamics were, in this case, more direct in terms of the culpability of key Khmer Rouge figures for producing mass suffering and death through overwork and the active denial of access to necessary food and basic health care than for many instances of mass executions. So this is where I feel very fortunate to know Jocelyn and the folks at CLEAR and to be invited to participate in this project. So what I've found in interacting with the literature and the many great people involved in the volume and the workshop that we had was that in terms of prevention of atrocity, the language of public health seems to provide an opportunity to introduce what I view as to be a better way of conceptualizing what atrocities are in the first place, which I think is an obvious kind of first step in broader prevention efforts. So in terms of conceptualization, as Jocelyn noted in her intro today, both atrocity prevention and public health are interested in preventing harms on a societal or population level. So my particular interest in prevention but in keeping with the public health team, is primarily in what I would say is diagnosis in terms of identifying and better understanding large-scale harms at a population level and ensuring that all mass harms are visible as potential components of broader atrocity processes. So regarding how this fits in with my broader research interests and the value of socially and legally reframing these issues, personally, I'm deeply concerned with the move to situate international crimes as the most pressing and important global justice issues, right? And I'm concerned that this will help perpetuate a longstanding and an ongoing erasure of harms experienced by the least powerful at the hands of the most powerful. So that is, I'm concerned that the most powerful actors in the world may be able to commit what I refer to in my forthcoming book as invisible atrocities. That is, to rather directly cause extreme amounts of suffering and or death while remaining free from the stigmatization and legal, but also moral and ethical responsibilities associated with being viewed as complicit in atrocity crimes. And I think we see that both in the minimization of past atrocities, including here in the United States, and the obfuscation of the criminality of more recent or ongoing atrocities, again, including here in the United States. I think this creates a major risk that the actors engaged in the kind of broader international criminal justice project, the vast majority of whom are deeply committed to using law to protect the world's most vulnerable populations, may at times kind of unknowingly be potentially contributing to the perpetuation of less spectacular but no less serious forms of violence, abuse, and oppression of these very same vulnerable groups by failing to recognize the culpability and potential criminality associated with such harms. So that's kind of how I come at it and how I view it, and what I see the value as my proposed kind of reconceptualization of this form of violence.
Thank you so much. That's a great way to kick us off and start this conversation. And I want to turn now to Laura and your work from the perspective of mental health consequences in the context of mass harms and conflict-affected violence, including trauma. So can you tell us what your research findings suggest are some of the key contemporary challenges of providing mental health and psychosocial support in conflict-affected settings? And then what are some of the developing innovations that respond to these challenges? And then connecting to what Randall was just discussing, do these innovations benefit from Randall's reframing of mass atrocity harms as public health crises?
What a great set of questions. Thank you, Jocelyn. I mean, I think just, I'm gonna start at the end real quick and then I'll circle back to it. I mean, I really appreciate Randall's reframing, and I think it links up in important ways with one of the key challenges confronting mental health and psychosocial care, and that is a question of scale, right? And so one of the challenges right now for mental health and psychosocial care is that the need for care, when we really do this kind of reframing about the scope of harm, right, on lots of different dimensions, the need for care is really high and really pressing. And in lots of conflict affected settings, the need vastly outstrips the availability of that care. And so then we have a lot of challenges that get introduced, right, related to ways in which health inequities are then expressed again, right, in the delivery of those mental health services. So that I think is a really big and pressing challenge. And we see it coming up in lots of different settings all over the world, right? So in Colombia, for example, the number of individuals seeking psychosocial support as a part of victim reparations vastly outstripped even the large number of constituents that were anticipated. And that resulted then in major slowdowns in the delivery of care, even though the care system itself was in many ways very sophisticated. So that high level of need and interest pushes forward then some really important questions about how we can bring effective assessment and care to scale. And then that, is another challenge. And I think there are some really exciting innovations taking place in the field. And so I'll just highlight a few, although there are certainly many we could talk about. One, I think, is responding to the challenge of a dearth of local trained mental health care professionals. And one of the ways that there's a significant body of work in mental health and psychosocial care has addressed this in conflict affected settings is through something called task sharing. So this is the implementation of interventions by trained lay paraprofessionals or health workers. So these are individuals who don't have a history of specialized training in mental health care, but they receive training specific to a particular mental health service and a particular approach, and then deliver that care in the community. So an example of a really exciting intervention was one done in Zimbabwe called the Friendship Bench. And in this, lay health workers were trained in a brief 6-session cognitive behavioral and problem-solving skills intervention and delivered that care on benches outside of health clinics. So it, revolutionized in some ways accessibility and community access, and was also an effective practice. So things like that are really exciting. The other ways, in which we can really think about expanding access to care that have changed in the past couple of decades are the integration of virtual forms of care or mobile mental health care. So we see this huge expansion of either fully virtual or virtually mediated forms of care. And, in many ways, the pandemic has, even further accelerated, right, the development of that. So if those, forms can be developed and refined as effective, they have a lot of promise because their scale and reach can be pretty great. And then I think, partnering with that, right, if we think about in-person care, there's also been a huge amount of work on group-based interventions. So there's been a lot of work on interventions in schools, but an increasing work on family-based approaches to care and how we think about kind of the interrelationship of individual and family-based care as they relate to community outcomes that we care about, particularly in conflict-affected settings.
Thank you. Your work is just so incredible. And it actually is a perfect seg to Ellie's work, because your work, Ellie, is assessing the needs of victims, survivors of atrocity crimes in achieving a sense of justice in the aftermath of mass atrocity. So not just the, not that it's only healing, but also the accountability and justice in the aftermath, and how victims, survivors feel about the processes of accountability. And so in your research and in your work, are courts or other transitional justice mechanisms currently equipped to provide the justice that victims need and survivors need?
Well, thanks, Jocelyn. I think it's pretty clear that within kind of transitional justice scholarship that we tend to ascribe transitional justice processes the potential to confer one or both of two benefits for victims, either some kind of therapeutic benefit or the achievement of a sense of justice. And as you said, I'm focusing at the moment, at least, on the sense of justice angle in my research. And what is clear is that it's obviously very, very clear that for victims, a sense of justice is very, very important for them. But it's also very important for society that victims achieve a sense of justice, because there's a strong suggestion, at least, that when victims have a sense of justice, there's less risk of a re-escalation of violence. So individual sense of justice works towards societal peace and cohesion. And it's also clear that when victims have a sense of justice, they tend to be much more satisfied with the judicial processes that they've engaged with. And so you get engagement with processes. And conversely, when that doesn't happen, victims become disillusioned with a judicial process, and that then affects the legitimacy of the institution and the legitimacy of its outcomes. But it can also lead to victim active disengagement from the institution. And of course, courts need victims to appear as witnesses. They're the lifeblood of the machinery. So this very, very singular need in victims, it affects not just the victims themselves, it affects societies and its search for the peace, and it affects the functioning and the legitimacy of the court. And the challenge that those courts have is that they have this incredibly important function that they need to achieve to achieve a sense of justice in victims. And at the same time, in law, a sense of justice isn't defined, and it's wholly undeveloped in law. And fortunately for us lawyers, psychologists and social scientists have been working with survivors and have been asking them why it is when they engage with some kind of justice mechanism in the aftermath of mass atrocities, what it is they hope to achieve by virtue of that engagement, and the assumption being that these are their specific justice goals. And there's a list of, I've sort of been through all these sort of different wonderful psychological research reports, and I've kind of distilled a list of about 15, and I won't bore you all with them now, but it's a really, really wide-ranging list. So it might include, for example, public moral denunciation of the crimes committed, some public acknowledgement, formal recognition of the pain that individuals have suffered. For some people, it's about telling their story, or I think as lawyers, we perhaps emphasize that one potentially to the detriment of lots of other justice needs. For some people, it's about achieving justice for loved ones. It's about discovering the truth about what happened to loved ones, and in some cases where they are, what became of them. It might be to prevent perpetration of further violence or to heal mental harm. And I think what the list shows is that the different capacities that victims approach courts in. So there's some of them are very personal. So it could be about healing mental harm or bearing witness for people that they've lost. And for other, and that shows them in their individual capacity as a victim. But of course, they're also a member of an affected society. So for some people, it's about pursuing peace goals. So what's very, very challenging for the courts in that situation is justice clearly can mean very, very different things to different people. And what the research shows is, while there were kind of sort of 15 or so different identified justice goals, witnesses, victims tended to have between 2 and 4. And that really shows that, it can be very, very different what people need, and people are approaching justice mechanisms with different needs and different justice aims. At the same time, when a justice mechanism might have quite a narrow remit in terms of what it's able to provide and in terms of the crimes that it's investigating. So just sort of by way of example, I've been working for the last couple of years specifically around mass grave investigation. So we know, for example, that victims' families need to know the fate and whereabouts of their loved ones. Those bodies need to be found, identified, and repatriated. So there's some kind of respectful, dignified commemoration. For a prosecutor in that situation, if you have a mass grave, to be frank, the identities of the individuals in it don't matter. You don't need to know the names of the individuals in it to prosecute your crime, because what you need is scale. And, so the needs aren't always compatible. What the court can do and what the victims want, they don't always meet. And that difficulty is magnified where in crimes of mass atrocity, you obviously have mass victimization. So have these huge number of victims seeking justice with, very, very potentially conflicting and very, very divergent justice needs. So at the moment, without a kind of a clear understanding of what a sense of justice even comprises, plus this hugely complex notion of what justice might comprise in those given circumstances, they're probably not ideally situated to provide victims with what they need.
It's incredibly important, right? I mean, the centering of victims in all of this work, in the public health, mental health related work, and in the access to justice, accountability work is imperative. And I want to get back to Randall because I'm also interested in how we are characterizing the harms even to begin with, and how important it is to center victims even with that harm characterization. I want to have Randall for a moment think about your reframing of atrocity through the lens of public health in 1 or 2 maybe examples to demonstrate how and why this may be more survivor-centered and responsive to victims' needs for justice. And Ellie's talking about this institutional deficiency or limitation, I guess, of the justice system. So if you did want to opine on that as well, that would be great.
Wow. Okay. Thanks for that question. And Ellie, you're actually both the previous interventions, I think, fit within kind of what I've been thinking about. So I think there's two examples that I'll talk about a little bit. First, I'll return to the Cambodian example, which is one I'm familiar with. And second, I wanted to talk about something a little more kind of contemporary. So I'm going to talk about some recent developments in Canada around settler colonial atrocities and kind of what's going on there. And just from the outset, I think both the previous interventions, this is relevant to, right? Because it both affects kind of the conceptualization of the harms, both affects who counts as a victim, right? Who's in and who's out in some situations. And who gets recognized as a victim. And then once that population fluctuates, then you may have fluctuation in the multitude of kind of expressed justice desires, wants, and needs within that population, right? So it definitely complicates things and fluctuates things. So the first example, that of Cambodia, I came to thinking more deeply about how and why certain of these kind of mass harm causation processes are viewed differently than others by looking at these, as I mentioned, the causal dynamics of famine in Khmer Rouge era Cambodia. So this is obviously a very dense topic. I could go on about this all day, and I'm happy to answer questions. But as a basic overview, we have a regime that took over a nation that was decimated by a brutal 5-year civil war, and they took over in 1975. Including an incredibly devastating and clearly criminal illegal bombing campaign carried out by the US and the Nixon administration. The population was weak, food supplies were low, and the agricultural sector, most notably rice production, was severely weakened. So nonetheless, the regime's leadership declared that the country would, through sheer will and revolutionary zeal, radically and rapidly overhaul the country's agricultural sector, and in doing so, triple normal rice yields from about 1 to 3 tons per hectare. Which was, of course, manifestly impossible on the time scale under even the best of conditions. Yet the regime, believing it had just defeated the US military, approached rice production as the new battlefield of the revolution. So local officials were then placed in a position where they were expected to provide, quote, excess rice to the state based on fantastical production targets. If they pointed out that these targets were impossible to meet, they were in all likelihood going to be purged along with their entire family and all of their subordinates. If they failed to remit enough rice to the state, they risked being purged again. So most, but not all of them, took the food from the people, right? Who themselves were forcibly made completely reliant on state rations, as the actions of growing, collecting, foraging for, or hunting and fishing for food were outlawed, as were the very acts of cooking or eating privately, right? Again, with the risk of imprisonment and or execution, right? So this was deeply intertwined with the kind of more spectacular forms of violence that, historically have been pushed to the fore when it comes to the Khmer Rouge experience in Cambodia. So over the 3+ years the regime was in power, the predictable result was an extreme nationwide famine that manifested itself and grew worse. The leaders knew of the famine, but blamed it on internal enemies, at least outwardly. So the result was that roughly 1 million people, or approximately 1/8 of the country's total population, were killed from some combination of famine and associated disease and overwork. So importantly, this was a universal, for me at least, this was a uniquely universal experience, including for those who ultimately survived, even if they were not beaten or imprisoned, right? So I could go into the details of kind of comparing the causality of this and other forms of violence at the time, but suffice to say, I would expect these issues of generalized famine and living conditions to kind of be at the apex of the priorities of a court, such as the Khmer Rouge Tribunal, right? Given the scale of the harms involved and the universality of the experiences of extreme deprivation-based suffering. Yet, as we've seen, the tribunal has focused a little bit on this, but much more on familiar atrocity crimes like mass executions, particular prison, torture, purges, forced transfer of populations. So I don't want to discount the salience of those issues, of course, but I think in relation to Ellie's important intervention regarding the need to kind of listen to and try to respond to the justice desires expressed by populations. So I spent a lot of time in rural Cambodia with an organization that works with survivors of this period. And one of my roles was to answer questions about the tribunal. Right? And time and again, the primary questions I got from many survivors I interacted with related to everyday experiences, right? Will the court prosecute them for starving us? Will the court prosecute them for forcing us to work so hard and live without shelter, food, and clothing, or rest, those kinds of things? So from my perspective, there's a kind of mismatch there, right? Arguably grounded in a failure to recognize and prioritize kind of the production of negative health outcomes versus the production of negative health outcomes through particular familiar modalities, right? Violence, imprisonment, these are familiar when it comes to atrocity, right? So I've written a bit on this with Savina Sirik in a piece that's forthcoming in the Southern Cal Interdisciplinary Law Journal. I'm happy to share with anyone interested. So that's kind of one example, and I think that shows us how, you know, it differentiates certain victims being in and out, voices being listened to. I think it reflects kind of one important theme, but obviously not universal, in kind of justice desires. And I think that those also relate, because the more people you exclude as being, you know, only victims of generalized living conditions, the more people who that may be among their primary justice desires of having those kinds of issues addressed, right? So that's kind of one example. And the second one is I think both highlights the role of this dynamic as well as the role of time in obfuscating these kind of unfamiliar forms of atrocity violence. So this example is there's been this, many people will probably be familiar, there's been a sudden spike in attention being paid to genocidal settler colonial violence in Canada following the unearthing of several mass graves of children on the grounds of former residential schools. Of course, these discoveries are awful and heart-wrenching. However, I think it's important to note that they do not provide us with anything particularly new in terms of available information on the violence involved, including the killings at these schools. The fact that thousands of children died or were killed, probably more accurately stated, at these schools has been public knowledge for many, many years, but we have chosen to not really listen to this and have it pointed out to us, right? There's abundance of evidence. We knew they just hadn't done the actual mapping of the graves, right? So more importantly, the residential school experience, especially now, has become to be viewed as the central or sometimes even sole component of the so-called cultural genocide of Indigenous populations in what is now Canada, right? So decontextualized, the activities of the actors involved in the residential schools may not amount to genocide as a matter of law, hence the cultural qualifier. They clearly do amount to various crimes against humanity in my view, but that fact is often ignored. I think, however, that if we approach this question in a broader sense, right, at a population level, maybe using some of the language of public health, experiences of settler colonial projects of violent domination and oppression in the service of gaining control over land and resources and establishing complete political dominance over Indigenous populations, from a public health informed conceptualization of violence, this can help us make the connections between various discrete instances of so-called direct violence, such as that occurring at the schools, and a broader criminal project of domination, right? So most notably, this includes various situations wherein Indigenous populations kind of face the choice between risking being subjugated to immediate forms of physical violence by the emerging Canadian state and settler populations it backed. So they had that choice versus exposing themselves to slower, more attritive forms of violence, right? I don't think there's a significant difference in the culpability of those behind the violence. If a victim group faces the choice of being immediately slaughtered versus penned into living in inhospitable, unfamiliar environments without access to basic resources necessary to build healthy communities, I think either outcome may be properly framed as relatively direct and potentially criminal in nature. So I view this slower, less spectacular form of violence and oppression suffered by Indigenous populations in Canada and of course elsewhere as a kind of interstitial material that connects and helps us make sense of the various outbreaks of spectacular violence committed against these populations, right? So I think there's this kind of background violence, and it helps us connect these different instances that otherwise may be decontextualized and disconnected, and doing so kind of treated as outliers, as regrettable, perhaps criminal outbreaks of violence, but not part of this overall kind of inherently criminal project that nation building was in North America and other contexts. So I think, or at least hope, that a public-based understanding of atrocity violence can help render these connections more visible. And furthermore, once we make these connections, we can better appreciate the kind of criminality, the immense scale and ongoing, especially the ongoing nature of the atrocity violence perpetuated in the name of capturing lands. So for example, that of the Lenape mentioned by Jocelyn at the outset, right? But these tend to be obfuscated. And I think going back to Ellie's point with justice desires, I think one she didn't mention, I'd be curious to see if it's on the 15 list, is that of land, right? And I think in many settler colonial and indigenous situations and contexts, and I don't want to oversimplify or overgeneralize, but return of land is a major issue. And that is one, and I think that kind of helps contribute. It has this positive feedback because the countries involved and the powerful actors involved, they don't want to do reparations or reparative work that has any real cost. They want to do things where they can provide important things such as, psychosocial support and different things, but they don't want to give back resources that have been taken. They don't want to give back land, and land is a primary issue in a setting such as Canada. And if we limit the violence to these schools, to these outbreaks of kind of direct, in a narrow sense, violence, then it helps us not avoid that conversation about, well, the violence, taking the lands was an inherent part of this violence. So what are we going to do about that now, right? So I think that's my hope, that this can, and I'm not, particularly optimistic this is going to happen quickly, but this is the conversations I want to try to contribute, and maybe in a small, very small way, give some language to articulating. So those are the examples that come to my mind.
Thanks, Randall. I do want to stick with you for a moment. I know that we have so much more to talk about, but I want to talk quickly for those who are not necessarily legally trained in the room. This might be something to discuss quickly, to think about some of the challenges to a reframing toward a public health perspective. I'm thinking specifically about international criminal law and some of the limitations that it has on thinking about causation and principles of legality and individual accountability. So I'm wondering what you see as the main challenges to that reframing, and how can we maybe rethink or overcome some of those challenges?
Yeah, that's, I think, an important kind of caveat there. So my goals are kind of twofold, right? And I've kind of talked about the first one a fair amount. So as I discussed, I think it's imperative that if we're going to continue to use atrocity and international criminal law as a rubric through which we think about and frame mass harm, we have to be open to rethinking how such harms actually unfold and to challenge our pre-existing notions of what forms crimes may take. And I think I've articulated that a little bit. But second, and this kind of goes directly to the challenges involved, I think it's important to recognize the inherent limitations of law, especially criminal law, in terms of the arrays, in two ways, in terms of the array of forms of violence and oppression it is equipped to deal with, and its success in dealing with that, right? So while I reject this kind of simplistic binary notion of direct versus structural violence, there are many instances where generalized oppression and violence is simply too causally diverse and too structural in nature to be addressed at all through a criminal law approach, right? So there's one limitation, right? And in this sense, I think in international criminal law, we don't really know what the outer boundaries of accountability are, because the law is so selective. And so there's no real internalized pressure to explore the boundaries. Like, why go after these unfamiliar atrocities when we have this plethora of obvious ones going on that are still not prosecuted, right? So we don't really know, but there is clearly a boundary, right? But on a broader level, I remain incredibly skeptical that traditional criminal law approaches, of prosecution and caging individual perpetrators can do much in the service of justice, right? Of course, this view is invariably colored by the fact that I teach criminal law in the US, right? A country whose criminal justice is in itself, in my view, one that involves not only systemic abuses of rights and perpetuates a racialized pseudo-caste system, but arguably itself rises to the level of implicating international criminal law in its own right, right? So in my hope is that this second set of limitations will actually help open new spaces where conversations, they're already happening, can continue about how we can move beyond a narrow criminal law paradigm in terms of how we respond to atrocity violence, right? Even that which is criminal, even the most traditional forms, once we're able to better understand what it is. So that's how I think through that.
Thank you. So much to think about. Okay, so at this moment, I am going to give all of our listeners their CLE code. So bear with me for 1 second, our panelists. The code for the CLE, grab your pens, is HEALTH, HEALTH, 23Z. So HEALTH 23Z. Okay. Now I want to turn, thanks Randall for all of that. So incredible, and so much food for thought. And now I want to turn back to Laura, because in thinking about the post-atrocity and post-conflict settings in which you are studying and working, and the fact that prevention and intervention is always worthwhile, no matter at which stage we're at in the cycle and process of atrocity crimes. How can research and practice in the field mutually inform the development and advancement of mental health and psychosocial support systems and their best practices?
Great. Yeah, thanks, Jocelyn. Yeah, I want to draw, I think something that came out of both Randall and Ellie's comments is really this idea of the importance of centering the voices of people who were affected, right, by the violence that has occurred. And that's important, right, from everything kind of as Randall was saying, and defining, right, what events are of most concern to how we think about our notions of justice, on Ellie's point. And then I think the same is true of mental health care. And so when I think about the reflexive engagement that should exist between research and practice, I think opportunities and ways in which we systematically and iteratively at every stage, right, are engaging with the people who, right, are affected by the violence is really, really critical. And there's lots of ways to do that. So, when we think about program design, I always tell people nobody sits down, right, and designs, or at least if you're holding to the principle of beneficence, right, nobody's going to sit down and design a program that they don't think is going to work, right? But we know that lots of programs don't work. So there's a tension there inherently. And I think the reflexive relationship between research and practice is really important in pushing through that. So the first thing that I think of, is we really need to consider diverse ways of knowing and what we mean by evidence. So certainly when we say evidence, a lot of people mean quantitative research or data analysis, right? And certainly I do that. So, I mean that sometimes too, right? And that's one type of evidence. And that type of evidence has some important things to tell us. But qualitative research is incredibly important, as is mixed methods work, to allow us to think about how those different forms of data speak to one another. And when we think about mental health and psychosocial support, it's also really important for us to think about multiple levels of evidence, right? Engaging with key actors and stakeholders at multiple different points to help us understand, best practices, how they can be improved and how they can actually be implemented in a way that is contextually and culturally relevant. So when we think about, research and practice in mental health and psychosocial care, right now, we have a growing body of evidence, and we know a lot about what I would consider domain or direct effects of programs, right? So we did a program, we're looking at how it affects anxiety or depression or, interpersonal relationships. But what we know less of, and I think where we need to kind of move in the field, is really thinking about why those effects occur, right? So what are the processes at play? And for whom do those, interventions work most effectively? And when we look at kind of that process-oriented research as it's happening, psychologists, there's a lot of data on kind of the internal or interpersonal processes, but in conflict-affected settings, right, we really need to be looking to, as is so evident, right, and Randall and Ellie's comments, all of these intersecting community and sociopolitical factors that really have complex overlays for, experiences, right, throughout the conflict, as well as, what reparations and justice look like on the other side. So as we move through and kind of develop our theories of change, I think it's really, really critical that we engage in that reflexive practice to develop some really robust frameworks, both for understanding how and why programs work, and then, how we evaluate their success.
Thank you. So Ellie, you are also calling for research to inform evidence-based practice in the justice and accountability space of transitional justice. So while we now are relatively well informed about the therapeutic impact that all of these justice processes have or can have on victims who engage with them, and that is both positive and negative impact, we know so much less about how justice processes affect the ability of victims, survivors to achieve that sense of justice that you're talking about. Why is that, and what more do we need?
Okay, well, as I said, the whole notion of a sense of justice simply it's just underdeveloped and it's undefined in the legal world. And so it's probably useful to think a little bit about why that is. And it's when we look at the goals for victims of transitional justice processes, we talk about some kind of therapeutic impact and the achievement of a sense of justice. And what we're looking at to achieve in both cases is a psychological impact in victims. And so it's effectively what we're asking legal mechanisms to do is to pursue psychological goals. And that's not something that, us lawyers are particularly comfortable with. It's less tangible, it's subjective, and it's how do you then measure it? And also, it's a subject in its relative infancy, and it's being looked at it from a number of different disciplines, which is wonderful, but it also means that as a result of this kind of like this diverse interest in this emerging subject, we don't have a common or shared language between disciplines. So it's actually quite difficult at the moment to share findings or translate findings across disciplines. So for example, we know that there are some psychologists who are, when they're looking at the psychological impacts of victims who engage with the justice system, they very, very clearly distinguish between the therapeutic impacts and the sense of justice. And then there's other writers who perhaps just talk much more vaguely about psychological benefits without distinguishing the nature of those benefits. So again, from them, it's quite hard to tease out, what are those benefits? What's the nature of those benefits? And then there's also, and this is something that I think lawyers are particularly guilty of in this area, is like we tend to talk about the healing effect of justice. But when you actually look at what is being spoken about, they're talking about all sorts of impacts that aren't necessarily therapeutic in nature, or certainly aren't exclusively or typically therapeutic in nature. And we tend to use this term healing as a bit of a catch-all for anything that's positive and psychological. And it kind of, for a start, presupposes that everybody who approaches the justice system is in need of healing. And yes, some of them certainly will be, but not all of them will be. And it's not everyone who engages with the justice system is is suffering ongoing traumatic symptoms, for example. And it also kind of suggests that victims aren't able to distinguish between, where it's appropriate to look for therapeutic healing. And, when we look at this list of reasons why people approached a justice mechanism, mental healing was there, but it was a very, very low, it was something like 6% of the people that were polled were looking for some kind of mental healing. It's not a significant driver for most people. They don't necessarily identify a court as the right place to go to for therapeutic healing. So, but we have this mixed language. So, and without a kind of a shared language, it's quite hard still to pull all those bits together. And where we do have literature, the preponderance of it focuses still on therapeutic impact rather than a sense of justice. And that's probably in part because sense of justice is still relatively intangible and it's undefined. But also I think because, the bulk of that work is being done by psychologists. So, it's given that, that their understandable interest is in sort of like therapeutic impacts of, the atrocities that they've experienced, and then as a follow-on that their experiences is within a justice process. It's quite understandable that the preponderance would be on therapeutic benefit, but and so at the moment it just hasn't been looked at because lawyers haven't really engaged in it. And but I mean, I suppose in some ways, somewhat optimistically, the idea of looking at psychological impact isn't wholly alien to the legal world, because we work with procedural justice, right? So we work with people who go through a court system and to say, like, is the process fair? And what we want to do is find out if they perceive the process that they've been through to be a fair one. And that's something that's, for example, it's happened at the International Criminal Court. I think Berkeley's been involved in a study that's looking at procedural justice, a procedural justice model to kind of evaluate that whole process. What that doesn't do is relate to any substantive sense of justice in the victim. And so I very often go back to a clinical model because so I spent 9 years working in a torture treatment centre in London. And as part of that work, we evaluated our service delivery. And we would ask our clients, when you came here, were you met at the door? Were you greeted kindly at reception? Was your interpreter there waiting for you when you arrived? Were they linguistically competent? Did your appointment start on time? Did you get your expenses? So we can see that our services are all running. That's the process of accessing the service. And we could see, I mean, that's the kind of like the clinical equivalent of procedural justice. None of that tells us if anyone's making a therapeutic recovery. And at the moment, that's what's lacking. And I think at the moment in law, we tend to hang on to this procedural justice so that people pursue justice, by which we tend to mean perpetrator accountability within a process that they deem to be fair, within procedural justice. Whereas what we need to be pursuing is a sense of justice in victims within a process that they deem to be fair. And I'd add on to that, and also psychologically safe. So that's where we're, I suppose, where we're lacking at the moment, but it's where we are. And I think there's, at least it's a growing area. So yeah, we may get there, but we're not there yet.
Thank you. There's a lot that you are proposing to interdisciplinary research and really reframing and reconceptualizing even the justice delivery, right, as not only procedurally, but going back to really the roots of substance of that, that not only is it fair, the substance is actually, received as bringing justice to individual victims, and then also for communities. And there's so much importance in prevention in what you're saying, that we need to be starting that conversation as well. And I want to stay with you for a second, Ellie. Can you tell us your thoughts on what legal and other practitioners in the post-atrocity transitional justice space can do to respond more fully to victims' justice needs, with this recognition that there is so much that we need to do institutionally and in the evidence-based research and really, you know, understanding this. But is there anything that we as practitioners can do now to improve that sense of justice that victims are feeling?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's going back to as well what Randall and Laura have both been talking about this very kind of victim-centered approach, because I think as lawyers and as practitioners, what we tend to do when a client or victim comes to us and they tell us they want some kind of justice, our impulse is to look to see what legal mechanisms there are available to them. You know, what's their national, what's their international or regional mechanisms that they could access. What, you know, is there anything that you can do at the UN for, you know, various UN special mechanisms? And instead, I think what we need to be doing is just spending a little bit of time talking with them to say, well, what would victim look like to you? What would justice look like to you? So, for example, again, going back to my time in the Torture Treatment Centre, I've had survivors who have been interested, wishing to pursue some kind of justice. And I've said, you know, what would that involve? What would that be? And they said, oh, well, I need to educate the world about what happened to me. I want to tell my story. And you can either, you know, sort of find some kind of judicial mechanism, but, you know, that person might, you know, you have to ask yourself, is a courtroom the best place to do that? Because it might take, you know, 5-10 years for that case to come to court somewhere. And that individual might not get a chance to narrate their story, like a free narration of their account. And it might be that the court's remit, the case that they're considering, is really, really quite narrow. And so it might not be interested in all of the experiences that individual has had, maybe just some, and that could give the perception that some are more important than others to the court, you know, to the victim, sorry. And, you know, and that individual is likely to have their credibility challenged, which can be hugely damaging. So, you know, you have to kind of, make an informed decision with that individual and say, well, you know, we can try this. But equally, you know, I've worked with survivors who've said, you know, do you know what, that's not for me. And we've looked at media interviews that, you know, that can happen in a week. You can get someone talking on the radio or doing sort of press interviews. I've worked with poets, artists, we've done theatre work. So there's where people are kind of working much more creatively with their stories. And I think at the moment, as lawyers, we don't conceptualize that as justice. But I think we need to start to think about the fact that a victim might, because if that meets justice needs, then who are we to tell them that's not justice? If that makes sense.
It absolutely makes sense.
I mean, I know that's hugely then problematic when you have a huge, when you have crimes of mass atrocities. And I think also we need to be much more mindful of the kind of like the informal justice sector. So for example, so after mass atrocities, there's likely to be NGOs going in and documenting crimes. And, you know, there's power in documentation. And, you know, there's likely to be victims and survivor groups emerging that might kind of get together and talk about their stories. And I think at the moment, they're seen as very, very separate to the court system. But I think in practice, there's quite a symbiotic relationship between the two. So, for example, we might see that someone who's been part of a survivor group where there's a lot of narration of stories, that person may then feel emboldened enough to come and give testimony. So, you know, I think it can work both ways. And at the same time, that group or some therapeutic process might give them the support that they need to be in the courts. You know, it kind of I think one can really, really help the other. And I think at the moment we don't, as lawyers, I don't think we use that enough. And I think, you know, we need to probably be mindful of that. You know, it's not necessarily all plain sailings, because I know, for example, that in sort of large group discussions where there's a lot of discussion about experiences, there can be a tendency for a dominant narrative to emerge, and it tends to be heroic. You know, we fought bravely, you know, all of this. And for someone, you know, that can have the effect of silencing other people. So for someone who really, really didn't feel brave at the time, who was absolutely terrified and deeply traumatized by the event, that can have the effect of silencing them rather than helping them speak out. and heroic narratives also tend to be masculine, so that can also have the effect of silencing women and their experiences of mass atrocities. And I also know, for example, a couple of investigators at the International Criminal Court who won't use as witnesses people who have given statements to the media or NGOs, because you then have the potential for inconsistency between statements. You want someone who's it's their one and only statement, because then there's no public inconsistency. So, you know, it's a balance, I think. But I think given all of that stuff is happening anyway, I think we need to be working with it rather than pretending it's working just alongside it a bit more.
Thank you so much. So much to think about in designing and potentially even redesigning systems of justice to meet victims' needs, and to really think outside of the box where we have been, I mean, even practically very limited with resources and ability to bring a sense of justice to, you know, entire communities, affected populations. And that brings me to a question that I have for Laura, because in thinking about post-atrocity peace building, I know that your work intersects with peace building. Can you help us understand the relationship between mental health and psychosocial support and peace building?
Well, I can try at least. But yeah, I mean, honestly, I think part of it is conversations like these conversations. Honestly, like, you know, multi-sectoral, lots of different perspectives kind of coming together, right, on some centering questions in terms of moving the field forward. I mean, certainly as I think about, you know, peace and peace building, I mean, I think of Peter Wallenstein's conception of quality peace, one component of which is human dignity, right, as central to a characteristic for quality and lasting peace. So as a psychologist, because I tend to think at the individual level, right? Certainly I think of mental health and psychosocial care, right, as a kind of key public good, right, in that, as a health right. And so I think in that sense, you know, it's really important to have it integrated into peace building frameworks, but also to uplink it, right, with these other questions, you know, about justice, about structural violence, because unless we're working synergistically at all levels, our efforts in mental health and psychosocial care are always going to be confounded by ongoing forms of violence that really prevent them from being able to be truly transformative, right, at multiple levels. And so I think, you know, the thoughtful balance, you know, in mental health and psychosocial care of, you know, cost, scale, effectiveness, you know, intersectoral relationships are more than just interesting research questions. They're actually really critical questions that have real world implications for access and for equity on the care delivery end. And I think too, there's also kind of this interesting parallel in psychology and peace studies in terms of the focus on negative versus positive outcomes. So in the context of peace studies, right, we talk about this as negative versus positive peace. So the absence of violence versus the presence of kind of a just and sustainable peace. And I think there's a parallel here for mental health and psychosocial care when we talk about the absence of distress versus the presence of flourishing, right? And the psychosocial care frameworks are really kind of oriented towards both. And I think it's important to think about those as dual goals, right? We're not just, you know, seeking to alleviate depression, for example, right? We're really interested and invested in interpersonal and relational community health in ways that are important for these kind of broader processes.
Thank you. It's all of the dots are starting to connect, and I'm getting a little bit giddy about the book project right now, because at first we brought everyone together with an understanding that everyone needed to be in conversation, but having this conversation today is really just bringing everything full circle. So I want to thank you all. And I want to ask one more question before we open it up to the audience. And I also want to make sure that I say one more time the CLE code. So for all of you who are asking for CLE credit, the CLE code is HEALTH 23Z. That's health, HEALTH, 23Z. Okay, so Randall, many folks right now may be thinking about pandemics. I don't know why, it might be on the front of people's minds, and other harms that are attributive in nature. And I want to ask, how should we be thinking about these public health harms, especially when they're combined with policies of populist nationalist governments, such as Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil, or even previous US administrations? There are direct harms, right? Negating science and evidence-based decision-making, policy-making, but there are also these indirect harms, allowing private corporations, for example, to enter and deforest indigenous lands in Brazil while everyone is focused on a pandemic. And these also have connections to historical and present genocidal processes against indigenous populations. So what are your thoughts? How should we be thinking about these harms? How far can we go in both a public health lens and an atrocity prevention lens?
Whoa, okay. So that was a can of worms of a question. But I'm going to try to give, like, I appreciate it. I think it's a great question. I think it's probably what I'm thinking about and other people are thinking about. But, you know, I'm going to just give a few thoughts, and maybe this would help segue to question and answer, right? So first, I want to emphasize above all else that there's not really any easy answers to these difficult questions and issues, and that there also may be kind of these fundamental tensions at play. But with that disclaimer, I do think there is some usefulness to thinking about issues of causality and culpability through an atrocity crime rubric and addressing these kinds of issues, the ones you highlighted, right? So we have many examples of how actors such as Trump or Bolsonaro actively exacerbated the harms of the pandemic with full knowledge of what they were doing, right? So clearly they were doing this for political and personal ends. But these motives, for the most part, under criminal law are irrelevant to assessments of culpability, right? So, for example, Trump apparently stepped in and blocked the Postal Service from distributing masks to all Americans early in the pandemic. He also, for example, held rallies at the peak of the pandemic where he actively discouraged mask wearing. So Bolsonaro did similar things in the context of the pandemic. He contracted COVID himself following appearing at a bunch of packed rallies without a mask, actually visibly spewing particulate into the crowd, yelling. So I think we can sometimes overcomplicate assessments of causality here. These and other similar actions quite clearly caused a discrete number of additional people to contract COVID and a subset of those people to die from the disease, right? While identifying individuals and assigning sole causality to Trump or Bolsonaro for them contracting and spreading the disease in individuals may not be feasible, this is not strictly necessary under international criminal law. As I think Ellie pointed out, when it comes to mass graves, it's the same thing. You don't need to know the individual victims, right? But so I think that's the first thing. I think that it's not outlandish to think through these issues through this rubric. And I think there are people who are pretty doctrinal, middle of the line people who have been starting to do that without and I think there's also an issue where making these connections to new potential ways of committing atrocities gets this pushback that I think is sometimes a bit premature in terms of, if all you can do is forecast potential culpability, you don't have a full investigation. You don't have the power of an entire court and actors and investigators. So all you can do is make these kind of rough assessments and forecast where the law might go. But I do think that that is a worthwhile endeavor to kind of point out these connections, right? So sometimes you get this pushback where it's like, unless you can definitively prove that someone like Trump could be successfully prosecuted and convicted for a discrete crime for this particular act, that is kind of dismissed as outlandish. But I think that kind of misses the point because it's putting the cart before the horse in a certain sense. I think we can also see a correlation between this outright flouting of basic public health measures and an especially violent attitude toward the right of indigenous people and other oppressed groups. So kind of going to the latter of what you mentioned in the Bolsonaro example. such as, you know, indigenous groups in Brazil, or in the context of America, we had the pandemic and you have the racial justice protests going on. So such as Black Americans subjected to extreme rates of police violence and incarceration, right? And Trump is obviously incredibly violent towards even having that pointed out, that basic fact and reality. So this is where I think the tension comes in, because I think we have to walk this fine line, right, between the inaccurate and in my view, non-useful trope of trying to identify individual bad apples, even if there are folks like Bolsonaro and Trump, and blame them for the totality of systemic, local, national, and international systems of oppression, right? And so you kind of have this bait and switch. You know, we talk about police reform and individual police officers being the bad actors, then you miss the system. But if you focus on the system, you miss the fact that many police officers are, you know, white nationalists, and there's an infiltration of police forces. So there's both of these things going on, and you have to kind of pay attention to both at the same time, right? So I think while you don't want to exclusively focus on individuals, you want to not let these kinds of privileged, powerful actors off the hook for their own roles in driving, perpetuating, and ultimately benefiting from these systems, right? So I think it's a difficult line to walk, but I don't think it's inherently contradictory. I think the bigger problem is when we start to move downward, right? To focus exclusively, and this is one of the problems of international criminal law often, on the lowest level actors who are implicated in systems of oppression, or maybe kind of carrying out the physical component of the actus reus of a crime. They may or may not benefit themselves or be from these systems. They may even be complicit in their own oppression, right? So, you know, if you think about a Black police officer, you know, that's a complicated figure, given the fact that policing in the US is a form of systemic oppression of Black Americans, right? And that's indisputable. So it's not easy, but there are these tensions, but I do think it's worthwhile and important to think about and carefully consider these issues, including through these lenses or rubrics of international criminal law, because of a few things. But I think the social salience of this framework and the way that it kind of highlights harms can be valuable, but it's often problematic in terms of kind of pushing down system-wide analyses. But if you insist on doing both, then I think that you can highlight the system if you focus on the most powerful actors, because they're the ones who are actively benefiting from this, right? And so kind of that's my general thoughts, but I'm happy to, get questions on that.
Great, thank you. So we are really on time, and I'm thankful to you all for keeping us on time with this conversation. And I want to now turn to some of the audience Q&A. The first question I want to pose to each of you, or all of you, or whoever is interested in opining. The question is about how a public health model can offer a holistic approach to prevent structural violence, as well as establish a positive psychosocial environment to promote healing and promote social determinants of mental health. So specifically in the question of mental health. But I think that's kind of stepping one step further from Randall's intervention, his last intervention, in really saying that there is a need, right? There is a need to address structural violence, and there is a preventative aspect to that. So I'm wondering if anyone is interested in giving that perspective from their point of view.
I'm happy to kick us off at least a little bit. I mean, when I think about, it's an awesome question, the utility of a public health model and the incredible importance of addressing structural violence. I think in terms of mental health and psychosocial care, I can think about that happening at different levels, right? So one way in which I think we continue to advance in addressing structural violence is kind of through this social determinants of health framework, right? So understanding how, embedding ourselves in a really solid social ecological framework that is highlighting and, capturing these complexities, right, in cross-system exchanges and how they affect individuals and individual flourishing, can really advance, right, care that is responsive to those social realities, but also challenges them. I also think that, at another level, right, like we need to think about this in a serious way in even the development and implementation of those programs, right? Because all of these programs, and I can't speak it all to the law, right, because I'm not a lawyer, but we're working in a system. And we know that in many ways that system is unjust. And so ways in which we can actively, fight that in the types of programs that we create and their construction and who is centered, right, in that programming, and how we do that, I think are all really critical to, addressing it at the systemic level, right, as practitioners.
I can follow up very briefly on that from a somewhat more legal perspective. And what that kind of made me think, and I think I completely appreciate everything you said, Laura, is that, I think one small discrete step can be, if you're in the sphere, be it in, domestic criminal justice or international criminal justice, is insisting on highlighting those connections, right? So you have, and that's kind of why one of my motivations is to break down that binary, is not to say that are pure forms of structural violence and direct forms and the pure forms that criminal law paradigm cannot reach. But if you kind of blur that distinction, then you can kind of also highlight the intertwined nature between even the purest forms of structural violence and the most direct. And so you can kind of highlight both a wider array of harms that may involve criminality, but also the connection between those forms of criminality and this other set of harms, which the criminal law just cannot touch in terms of individual accountability, because the causal mechanisms are just too complex to establish the required degree of causality and culpability, right? So I think that's on the front end, one thing you can do. I would encourage folks operating in these spheres to think about. And then if you've made those connections on the back end, when it comes to what the implications of things like convictions are and different things, even if there's certain issues that cannot be addressed directly by a court, if they identify the ongoing harms that may be structural in nature from a discrete harm that is criminal, or may implicate criminal law in some way, then that reframes what appropriate redress would mean, right? Because if this harm has caused, if this crime has caused this other harm, even indirectly, then maybe we have to have a conversation about what that means. And that's where I think things like questions of land and questions of current public health crisis faced by people such as indigenous populations and Black Americans are connected, right? And if you can draw those connections, then you can make demands for change that have, you can at least try to be contributing to those demands for change, but maybe not satisfactorily.
I have something very small to add there. It's a little bit outside of my area, to be honest, but just to add there, just looking at the link between the prevention of violence and a positive psychosocial environment. And I know there's I've been talking very much about sort of therapeutic impacts and sense of justice as if they're two discrete elements. But, it's a little bit of a sort of a falsehood, because in reality, they kind of intersect quite a lot. But I know there's certainly some research that shows that positive psychological health and well-being also reduces, heightens forgiveness levels, for example. So there's a link between positive mental health and societal peace and cohesion through better heightened forgiveness levels.
Thanks. Oh, wow. Okay, so we are getting close to the end of our discussion. So in the sense of, wanting to keep with time and everyone's schedules, I want to just open it up to you in this amazing conversation for any final thoughts that you might have. Any kind of conclusory remarks, maybe something that I didn't, or the audience Q&A didn't get to, that you'd like to offer as final thoughts.
We, engage with one another and can kind of move things forward. So thank you to all of you and to Jocelyn for moderating this.
Yeah, I
thank you so much.
And I guess my little follow-up would be I agree, these are incredibly important. And from my perspective, as a trained lawyer, I don't know how people in other fields feel, but it can be, you can feel uncomfortable and out of your depth by trying to pull in these, there's this massive gap, right? As an international criminal lawyer, there's this massive gap, but you're like, this is my road, so I just won't pay attention to this massive gap. And I think the ability to become comfortable in the discomfort of not being the expert and trying to draw in different fields, for all the lawyers who are attending, to be okay with that and to try to seek out other sources of knowledge and validate them. It can be difficult, but it is, I think, important. And it's really the only way forward. So just to try to be comfortable in that discomfort, right? To just constantly be interrogating what you're doing and be willing to change and willing to be open. And lawyers are one of the prime examples of the people who are just like, oh, you're not a lawyer? Okay, I'm not going to listen to anything you say. But because what I'm doing is law and you don't understand it, and we don't do that, etc. So I think, and I'm sure this happens in other disciplines as well, right? But I just know us, and I know that we're bad at that way. So just try to listen and try to be engaged, but just be able to be comfortable in that discomfort. Like, I didn't frankly understand every last thing that Laura and Ellie were saying, probably a little more from Ellie, but I feel that I learned things even from this webinar and in our meeting that we had previously. And it's an iterative process to just be open-minded. So that's what I would, just be open-minded and try to seek out other disciplines. What I would close on.
Well, I definitely want to say to all of you, thank you for all that you're bringing to this work. And, as someone who thinks about human rights and mass atrocity prevention daily, I am also someone who feels like I'm constantly a jack of all trades, master of none, but recognizing, I think, where we have these hugely complex problems that we need to address and solve, and recognizing that we as professionals increasingly get into our silos and our ways of thinking and knowing, and that is a detrimental force for the ultimate goals that we're all trying to achieve, and to really intentionally back ourselves out of those silos and to have conversations like these, as Randall was mentioning, is so incredibly important for what we all want as end results, which is, both from a public health, mental health perspective, we want preventing harms or healing and, resilience in the face of harms. And for mass atrocity prevention, we want to recognize and address those risks before we see spectacular violence, and even this more endemic, invisible violence that we want to make more visible, so that we can recognize and respond to those processes more upstream than we are now addressing them very, very far downstream. So I just really appreciate all of you and the work that you're doing and making this work in atrocity prevention, this really nascent field, something that is evidence-based, that is really critical, and thinking about our very narrow frames and how can we widen them and how can we more aptly address and center victims and their voices and their needs at the forefront of the work that we're doing, both for healing and for future prevention. So I just want to thank you so much for coming and for all of the participants today. This is the beginning of hopefully a longer journey and conversation, interdisciplinary, multidisciplinary conversation, and a network that we want to be building so that we can continue to have these important conversations at high levels and then bring it into the work that we're doing on the ground that can then, you know, retrofit into scholarship and future work. So thank you so much for all of you. And I guess that's all for today. Join us for the next digital dialogue series on November 10th. And we look forward to that conversation as well.